Welcome. This is the Sleepy Biologist. If you're listening now, wherever you are, thank you for being here. To the members of this channel, to those who've left a super thanks, your support makes this possible. It allows these quiet explorations to exist. If you'd like to join, there's a link below. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, a like or subscription helps others find this space too. And if you'd like, leave a comment about where you're listening. In bed? On a couch? Somewhere else entirely? It's good to know you're there. Tonight, we're going inside, to a place where decisions happen without sound, where your body is always choosing, always prioritizing, always trying to keep you alive. Right now, inside you, something is running low. Not dangerously, not suddenly, but gradually. And your cells are noticing. You don't feel it yet. You might never feel it at all. But the response has already begun. Fuel is being redirected. Priorities are shifting. Some processes are being asked to wait. This is what happens when energy starts to thin. When the body realizes it can't power everything at once. When silence begins to replace abundance. Not all at once. Just enough that something has to give. Your body uses a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It's made inside nearly every cell, thousands of times per second, used immediately, then made again. It powers your heartbeat, your breathing, the firing of neurons in your brain, the contraction of muscles in your fingers, every single movement, every thought, every repair. And it's made from what you eat, from glucose mostly, sometimes from fat, sometimes from protein. Your mitochondria break these down. They extract energy. They build ATP. But what happens when the fuel slows? When glucose drops? When fat reserves begin to empty? When the body realizes it's running on less than it's used to? It doesn't panic. It adjusts. Quietly. Without asking permission, without announcing the change. First, the cells that don't need constant energy are told to wait. Skin cells slow their division. Hair follicles pause their growth. Muscle repair is postponed, not stopped, just delayed. The brain still gets what it needs. So does the heart. So do the lungs. These are non-negotiable. Everything else can be rationed. You don't notice this happening. There's no sensation. No warning signal. Your body simply begins conserving, redistributing, protecting what matters most. Inside your liver, glycogen is being broken down. It's a stored form of glucose, built up when food was abundant, released now, slowly, into your bloodstream. Your muscles hold glycogen too, but theirs is private. It can't leave. It can only fuel the muscle it belongs to. So when energy drops, muscles start making choices. They stop rebuilding as quickly. They hold on to what they have. They wait. And if the shortage continues, they begin breaking themselves down. Quietly. Protein becomes glucose. Muscle becomes fuel. Your fat cells respond differently. They release fatty acids. These travel through your blood, They reach tissues that can burn them. The heart prefers fat. So do resting muscles. The brain cannot use it directly, so the liver steps in. It converts fat into ketones, small molecules, water-soluble. They cross into the brain. They keep neurons firing. They keep thoughts forming. This shift is gradual. It takes hours, sometimes days. Your body doesn't switch fuel sources instantly. It transitions, gently, trying to avoid disruption. But there's a cost. Ketones work. They sustain the brain, but not as efficiently as glucose. Thinking feels slightly slower. Memory formation dips. Focus wanders. You might not connect it to fuel. You might think you're just tired or distracted. But inside, your neurons are conserving energy, prioritizing survival over clarity. Meanwhile, your mitochondria are working harder. They're trying to extract more energy from less fuel. They speed up. They work longer. They begin to wear. Mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from yours. They divide on their own schedule. But they can't divide forever. They accumulate damage. Slowly. Over time. When fuel runs low, they accumulate damage faster. They produce more waste, more reactive oxygen, more byproducts that need cleaning up. And cleaning up takes energy too. So the cycle tightens. Less fuel means harder work. Harder work means more damage. More damage means less efficiency. Less efficiency means even less fuel available. Your body knows this. It's been managing this balance for as long as you've been alive. Longer. It's been doing this for millions of years. Across every ancestor you've ever had. Surviving shortages. Adjusting. Redistributing. And it's doing it now. Right now. While you're listening. While you're resting. While you're still. Somewhere inside you, a cell is deciding. It's measuring what it has. It's comparing that to what it needs. And it's making a choice. Silently. Without fanfare. Maybe it delays a repair. Maybe it slows a process. Maybe it borrows from one system to support another. These are small decisions, invisible decisions. But they add up. And if the shortage continues, the decisions become more significant. Non-essential systems begin to shut down, slowly. One by one. The body protecting its core, sacrificing the periphery. This is not failure. This is strategy. This is survival. Your body is not breaking. It's adapting. It's doing what it's always done. Choosing what to keep alive. But there's a threshold. A point where adaptation becomes limitation. Where redistribution becomes loss. Where the body can no longer sustain everything it once could. Not because it's weak, but because the fuel has run too thin. You won't feel that threshold approaching. Not directly. But but your body will. And it will keep adjusting, keep compensating, keep choosing, until there's nothing left to choose. For now, the choices are small. The silence is soft. The redistribution is gentle. Your cells are managing. Your mitochondria are working. Your body is alive. And somewhere in that quiet space, between having enough and not having enough, your body is always deciding, always prioritizing, always trying to keep you here, in this moment, listening, breathing, alive. Every cell in your body is wrapped. Not tightly, not rigidly, but precisely. The membrane around each cell is about 7 nanometers thick, 7 billionths of a meter. Thinner than anything you could see, thinner than light itself can resolve. And yet it controls everything. It decides what enters, what leaves, what stays. It holds the cell's shape. It responds to signals. It repairs itself when torn. It's always moving. The membrane is made of fat, phospholipids, molecules with 2 sides. One side loves water, the other avoids it. So they arrange themselves in a double layer. Heads out, tails in. This creates a barrier. Water can't cross easily. Neither can most molecules. Salts, sugars, proteins, they're all too large or too charged. They need permission. They need pathways. And those pathways are proteins, embedded in the membrane. Some form channels. Some form pumps. Some are gates that open and close. Some are transporters that bind to specific molecules and carry them across. This is where fuel arrives. Glucose molecules approach the membrane. They can't pass through the fat, so they find a transporter, a protein shaped to hold them. It shifts. The glucose crosses. The protein resets. This happens constantly, thousands of times per second, across millions of cells. Fuel flowing in, keeping everything alive. But the membrane isn't passive. It's selective. It doesn't let everything through. It checks. It responds to the cell's needs. When energy is low, more transporters appear. When energy is abundant, some are taken away. The cell is always adjusting, always sensing. It reads the concentration of glucose outside, compares it to the concentration inside, decides how much to allow in. And it's not just glucose. Oxygen crosses differently. It's small enough to slip through the fat. It dissolves into the membrane, passes through, reaches the mitochondria waiting inside. Carbon dioxide leaves the same way, a waste product of energy production. It builds up inside the cell, diffuses outward, crosses the membrane, enters the blood, travels to the lungs. This exchange never stops. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Glucose in, waste products out. The membrane managing every transaction. But membranes wear. They're not permanent. The phospholipids oxidize. Free radicals damage them. Proteins embedded in them break down. Channels lose their shape. Pumps slow. When energy is low, repair slows too. The cell needs ATP to rebuild its membrane, to replace damaged proteins, to maintain the pumps that keep sodium out and potassium in. These pumps consume nearly a third of all ATP a cell makes. If ATP drops, the pumps falter. Sodium begins leaking in. Potassium drifts out. The balance shifts. Just slightly. But enough. The cell swells. Water follows sodium. It always does. Osmosis. The membrane stretches. Tension increases. The cell compensates. It tries to push sodium back out. But that takes energy. More ATP. And if the cell is already running low, it can't keep up. The swelling continues. Slowly. Imperceptibly. Inside, organelles feel the pressure. Mitochondria compress. The endoplasmic reticulum distorts. Ribosomes detach from their positions. Protein production stutters. And still the membrane holds. It's flexible. It can stretch further than you'd think. But there's a limit. A point where the phospholipids pull too far apart. Where small gaps form. Where the barrier starts to fail. When that happens, things cross that shouldn't. Calcium floods in. It's normally kept outside, tightly controlled. But through the gaps it enters. And calcium is a signal. A very loud signal. It activates enzymes. Enzymes that break things down. Proteases that cut proteins. Lipases that dissolve fats. Nucleases that fragment DNA. They're meant to help with digestion, with recycling damaged parts. But when calcium floods in uncontrolled, they activate everywhere. The cell begins digesting itself. Not intentionally, not as a decision, but as a consequence of a membrane that couldn't hold, of pumps that couldn't keep up, of energy that ran too thin. This doesn't happen quickly. It's not dramatic. A cell can limp along with a damaged membrane for hours, sometimes days. It keeps trying to repair, keeps trying to restore balance. Other cells around it don't notice, not right away. They're busy with their own membranes, their own fuel intake, their own survival. But if many cells start failing, if membranes across a tissue begin losing integrity, then something larger shifts. The tissue weakens. Function declines. Not all at once, just gradually, quietly. You might feel it as fatigue, or weakness, or nothing at all. The body has redundancy, extra cells, extra capacity. It can lose some cells and still function. It can lose many cells before you notice. But the loss is happening. At the level of membranes. At the level of molecules crossing or not crossing. At the level of barriers that used to hold. The membrane is so thin. So easy to overlook. But everything depends on it. Every nutrient. Every signal. Every waste product removed. Every ion kept in balance. When fuel runs low, this is one of the first things to suffer. Not because the membrane itself needs much energy, but because maintaining it does. Repairing it does. Keeping the pumps running does. And when the membrane begins to fail, everything inside begins to fail. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but steadily, inevitably. Right now, your cells are maintaining their membranes perfectly. Millions of transporters are working. Billions of phospholipids are arranged. Pumps are turning. Balance is held. But it takes effort. Constant effort. Constant energy. And if that energy thins, even slightly, the membrane will be the first to know. It won't announce it. It won't signal. It will just begin to let things through. Things that shouldn't cross. And hold back things that should. And somewhere in that reversal, the cell will start to change. Not because it chose to, but because the boundary that defined it, that kept it separate from everything else, that decided what it was and what it wasn't, is no longer deciding. The membrane is failing, and with it, everything. There's a history inside every cell. A very old one. Older than bones, older than blood, older than almost anything you'd recognize as human. Your mitochondria remember it. Not consciously, but structurally. In their shape, in their DNA, in the way they divide. They remember being separate. About 2 billion years ago, a larger cell consumed a smaller one. The smaller cell could do something remarkable. It could use oxygen to extract energy. The larger cell could not. So instead of digesting it, the larger cell kept it, and the smaller cell stayed. Generation after generation. It divided when the host divided. It shared its energy. In return, it was protected, fed, sheltered. This arrangement never ended. It became permanent. The smaller cell became an organelle, the mitochondrion. And every cell in your body carries descendants of that ancient partnership. Mitochondria still have their own DNA, separate from yours. Circular, like bacteria. Much smaller than the DNA in your nucleus. Only 37 genes. But those genes are essential. They code for proteins involved in energy production. Proteins that can't be made anywhere else. Your nuclear DNA codes for hundreds of other mitochondrial proteins. But these 37 must come from the mitochondria themselves. They're irreplaceable. And mitochondria divide on their own schedule. Not when the cell divides. When they need to. When energy demand increases. When old mitochondria wear out. They split in two. Like bacteria still do. But there's a limit. Mitochondria accumulate damage over time. Their DNA mutates. Their membranes degrade. Their proteins misfold. And unlike the rest of the cell, they can't fully repair everything. Each time a mitochondrion divides, it passes on some of that damage. Not all of it. The cell tries to sort the damaged ones out, tries to recycle them, but some slip through. Some keep dividing. Over years, over decades, the damage accumulates. More mutations, more misfolded proteins, more membranes that leak, and energy production begins to decline. Not everywhere at once. Some tissues feel it sooner. Brain cells, heart muscle, skeletal muscle. Tissues that need constant energy. Tissues that can't rest. When fuel runs low, mitochondria work harder. They have to. Less glucose means they must extract every bit of energy they can. They speed up their processes. They run closer to their maximum capacity. But running at maximum capacity creates heat and waste. Reactive oxygen species. Molecules with unpaired electrons. They're unstable. They react with anything nearby. DNA, proteins, lipids. They damage whatever they touch. Mitochondria have defenses, antioxidant enzymes, systems to neutralize reactive oxygen. But those systems need resources. They need energy. They need raw materials. When fuel is low, those resources are scarce. The defenses weaken. The reactive oxygen builds up. It damages the inner membrane, the place where energy is actually made, where electrons flow through protein complexes like water through a mill. The complexes are delicate, precise. They hold proteins in exact positions. They shuttle electrons along a chain. Each step releases energy. That energy pumps protons across the membrane. The protons flow back through another complex, and that flow makes ATP. But if the membrane is damaged, protons leak. They cross without making ATP. Energy is lost as heat. The mitochondrion works harder to compensate, which creates more reactive oxygen, which damages the membrane further. The cycle tightens. Damage creates more damage. Inefficiency creates more inefficiency. And the mitochondrion begins to fail. The cell notices. It has quality control systems. Proteins that mark damaged mitochondria. Other proteins that engulf them. Pull them into compartments. Break them down. Recycle their components. This process is called mitophagy. Mitochondrial autophagy. The cell eating its own mitochondria. Not as destruction, as maintenance, as renewal. It happens constantly. Old mitochondria removed, new ones dividing to replace them. The population turning over, staying fresh, staying functional. But mitophagy requires energy. It requires ATP. It requires proteins to be built, systems to be activated. And when energy is low, mitophagy slows. Damaged mitochondria linger. They keep trying to make energy. They keep failing. They keep producing reactive oxygen. They keep damaging themselves and the cell around them. And the cell can't clear them fast enough. So the number of functional mitochondria drops. Not because they stop dividing, but because more are damaged than are being replaced. The balance shifts. Energy production falls. You don't feel individual mitochondria failing. You can't. But you might feel the cumulative effect. Muscles that tire faster. Thoughts that take longer to form. A body that recovers more slowly. That needs more rest. These are the signs of mitochondria at their limit. Not gone. Not destroyed. Just fewer. Just less efficient. Just older. And inside each one, the machinery is still turning. Electrons are still flowing. Protons are still being pumped. ATP is still being made. But less of it, and at a higher cost. Mitochondria were never meant to be perfect. They were never meant to last forever. They're remnants of an ancient symbiosis, bacteria that traded independence for safety. And they still carry that history, that vulnerability. They divide like bacteria. They die like bacteria. They accumulate damage like any living thing. And when resources run low, they struggle like any living thing would. Right now, Your mitochondria are working, billions of them, in every cell, dividing when needed, being cleared when damaged, making energy from oxygen and fuel. But they're counting. Not intentionally, but structurally. Each division leaves a mark. Each bout of stress adds damage. Each shortage pushes them closer to their limit. They'll keep going for as long as they can, for as long as you need them to. They have no choice. They're bound to you, as you're bound to them. An ancient partnership, still holding, still turning fuel into life, still remembering what they once were, still doing what they've always done. For 2 billion years, and counting. The body operates on priorities you never agreed to, decisions made without consultation, a hierarchy of fuel written into every cell long before you were born. It begins with what's easiest, what's closest, what dissolves most readily into energy, and only when those reserves empty does it turn toward what it would rather keep. This isn't cruelty. This is survival arranged in layers, each one deeper than the last, each one harder to reverse. Imagine a house in winter, where the family burns firewood first because it's stacked and dry and meant for this purpose. When the firewood runs out, they burn the furniture, the chairs and tables that once held meals and conversations, things they needed but can live without. And when the furniture is gone, they begin pulling boards from the walls, from the floors, from the frame itself, knowing that each piece removed makes the house weaker, makes survival harder. But warmth is survival, and survival requires burning something. Your body is this house, and fuel shortage is this winter. And what burns is decided not by you, but by what will keep the center warm the longest. The first fuel is glucose, dissolved in your blood, circulating freely, available to any cell that needs it. It's immediate energy, fast energy, the kind that powers a thought or a heartbeat without delay. Your blood holds only about 4 grams of glucose at any given time, enough to sustain you for minutes, maybe 15 if you're resting, less if you're moving or thinking hard. This is the firewood, the reserve meant to be used and replaced constantly, never meant to last. When blood glucose drops, your liver responds within seconds. It holds a reservoir called glycogen, glucose molecules linked together in branching chains, stored tight in the liver's cells like grain in a silo. The liver can hold about 100 grams of glycogen, enough to sustain blood glucose for several hours, releasing it steadily, precisely, in response to hormones that signal need. Your muscles hold glycogen too, another few hundred grams, but muscle glycogen is selfish. It cannot leave the muscle. It can only fuel the muscle it belongs to. So when you're at rest, it stays locked away, private, unavailable to the brain or heart or any other tissue. This is the furniture, useful and substantial, but once it's gone, it takes time and food to replace. After 12 hours without food, maybe sooner if you've been active, the liver's glycogen is nearly depleted. Blood glucose begins to waver, and the body, sensing this, begins to shift its strategy, begins to look elsewhere for fuel. It turns toward fat, the most abundant energy reserve in the body, stored in adipose tissue, in cells designed to hold it, to expand and contract as fuel comes and goes. A person of average size might carry 10 or 15 kilograms of fat, which sounds like a lot, and it is. But fat burns differently than glucose, slower, less directly, requiring conversion before most tissues can use it. The fat cells release fatty acids into the bloodstream, small molecules that travel to muscles, to the heart, to organs that can oxidize them, break them down, extract their energy. But the brain cannot burn fat, at least not directly, and the brain is non-negotiable, so the body must do something else. The liver begins converting fatty acids into ketones, small water-soluble molecules that can cross into the brain, that can substitute for glucose when glucose is scarce. This process is called ketogenesis, and it takes a day or two to ramp up fully, to produce enough ketones to sustain the brain at rest. Ketones work. They keep neurons firing, they keep thoughts forming, but they're not as efficient as glucose, not as clean, not as quick. The brain on ketones is a brain running on a backup generator, functional but not optimal, slightly slower, slightly foggier, slightly less capable of holding multiple things at once. This is the wallboards, the structural components being repurposed, and it works. It keeps the house standing, but it's not the same as firewood. For days, even weeks, the body can sustain itself on fat and ketones, maintaining blood glucose through careful regulation, through the liver producing just enough sugar from other sources, from glycerol released by fat cells, from lactate recycled by muscles, from small molecules scavenged and reassembled. This is efficient survival, the body running on reserves it was designed to use, and if food returns, the process reverses, glycogen refills, ketone production slows, everything returns to baseline. But if food doesn't return, if the shortage continues past the point where fat alone can sustain, the body faces a problem. It still needs glucose, a small amount but an essential amount, for red blood cells that lack mitochondria and can only burn glucose, for certain brain cells that cannot fully adapt to ketones, for repair processes that require glucose specifically. And when fat and recycled molecules can't provide enough, the body turns to the only source left: protein. Protein is not stored the way fat is stored. It's not held in reserve. It's not sitting idle waiting to be burned. Protein is structure. It's muscle fibers and enzymes and antibodies and collagen. It's the working components of the body, the machinery itself. To burn protein for fuel is to dismantle the tools while still needing the tools. To break down the house's frame because there's nothing else left that will burn. And yet the body does this. It must. Because survival in this moment takes precedence over strength tomorrow. Because staying alive requires fuel, and fuel requires breaking something down. This is not a decision made lightly, not a process entered into casually. The body resists this as long as possible, but when fat stores dwindle and glucose demands persist and no food arrives, protein catabolism begins. Muscle target because it holds the most protein, because it can be spared more easily than organs, because movement can slow, but the heart must keep beating and the brain must keep thinking. The body doesn't destroy muscle wholesale. It's selective. It takes what it needs. Amino acids cleaved from muscle proteins, transported to the liver, converted into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. Each gram of muscle protein can become about half a gram of glucose, which means to maintain just the baseline glucose needs of the brain and red blood cells, the body must break down 50 or 60 grams of muscle per day. That's not a large amount in a single day, barely noticeable, but over weeks it accumulates. Strength fades, mass diminishes, the body becomes visibly thinner, movements require more effort, fatigue sets in earlier. The furniture is gone now, the walls are coming down, and the house, though still standing, is fragile. But muscle isn't the only source. When muscle protein depletion becomes significant, when the body senses that further loss would compromise essential functions, it begins taking protein from elsewhere. From the gut lining, from the immune system, from enzymes that facilitate digestion and repair, from proteins that transport molecules through the blood, from structures that seemed untouchable but turn out to be negotiable after all. The immune system weakens, infections take hold more easily, wounds heal more slowly. The gut becomes less effective at absorbing whatever nutrients might arrive. This is the body cannibalizing itself in order, taking from the periphery before the core, sacrificing what it can afford to lose. But there's a threshold beyond which loss is no longer strategic, beyond which the body cannot maintain the processes that keep it alive. And it approaches that threshold quietly, without warning, without any clear signal that the point of no return is near. The body still prioritizes the heart, still protects the diaphragm, the muscles essential for breathing, for circulation. These are preserved until almost the very end. But even they are not immune. Even they can be broken down if the shortage lasts long enough, if every other source has been exhausted and survival demands just a few more days of fuel. By this point, the person is visibly wasted. Movement is minimal. Consciousness drifts. The body enters a state of deep conservation, shutting down everything that isn't absolutely necessary. Digestion stops almost entirely because there's nothing to digest, and the energy required to maintain the digestive system is energy better spent elsewhere. Body temperature drops because maintaining heat requires fuel, and fuel is gone. The heart slows, the breathing shallows, the mind becomes less tethered to the world, and still, somewhere deep in the cells, ATP is being made. Mitochondria are still functioning. Enzymes are still catalyzing reactions. The fundamental processes of life continue at a reduced scale, a whisper of what they once were, but not yet silent. The body burns what it has because that's all it can do, because stopping would mean dying, and the body does not choose to die. It only runs out of options, runs out of fuel, runs out of things to break down. This is not failure. This is biology reaching its limits. This is a system designed for survival, confronting a situation where survival is no longer possible without external input. And when that input doesn't come, the burning continues until there's nothing left to burn. Right now, your body is not burning itself. It's burning what you've given it. Glucose from meals, fat from reserves that are comfortable and sufficient, protein being used for repair and maintenance, not for fuel. The hierarchy exists, but you're nowhere near the bottom of it, nowhere near the point where hard decisions must be made. But the system is always there, always waiting, always ready to shift if circumstances demand it, always prepared to prioritize survival over everything else. First sugar, then fat, then protein, then whatever remains. This is the order. This is the logic. This is how the body survives when there's nothing left. And it will follow this order without asking, without hesitation, because survival is not a choice. It's a compulsion written into every cell. The house will burn what it must. The walls, the frame, the foundation itself. And when everything burnable is gone, the house collapses. Not because it wanted to, but because fire needs fuel. And fuel, eventually, runs out. Air comes in. You don't measure it, don't count it. It just arrives, fills the lungs, does whatever it does, leaves again. Automatic. Constant. But inside. Deep inside, past the lungs, past the blood, inside the cells themselves, oxygen is being counted. Very carefully. Not by you. By molecules that sense it. Proteins that change shape when oxygen levels shift, even slightly. They notice. And they respond. Oxygen is strange when you think about it. Invisible. Odorless. You'd never know it was there except that without it, everything stops. Not immediately, but eventually. Red blood cells carry it. Hemoglobin inside them, iron at the center, binding oxygen in the lungs, releasing it in the tissues. 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin, millions of hemoglobin molecules per red blood cell, trillions of red blood cells circulating, all of them ferrying oxygen, all the time. The blood reaching your brain, your heart, your kidneys. It's red because it's full of oxygen. When it leaves those organs, it's darker, purplish, because the oxygen has been taken. And what takes it? Mitochondria. Always mitochondria. They pull oxygen from the blood, from the fluid around them, into themselves. They use it in the final step of energy production, the step that makes the most ATP. Without oxygen, mitochondria can still make a little energy. From glucose, through glycolysis, breaking sugar into smaller pieces. But it's not much. 2 ATP molecules per glucose, compared to 30 or more when oxygen is present. So oxygen matters. A lot. More than almost anything. And the body knows this. Guards it. Prioritizes it. When you breathe in, oxygen crosses from the air sacs into tiny blood vessels, capillaries, so thin their walls are 1 cell thick. Oxygen dissolves through, binds to hemoglobin, gets carried away. How much oxygen you absorb depends on a few things. How deeply you breathe, how well your lungs work, how much hemoglobin you have, how well your blood flows. Little changes in any of these, and oxygen delivery drops. Your body compensates. Usually. If you climb to altitude where air is thinner, you breathe faster. Your heart beats faster. More blood circulates. Over days, you make more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, more capacity. But compensation has limits. If oxygen drops too far too fast, or if it drops just slightly but stays low for a long time, the body starts choosing. Which cells get priority? Which can wait? Brain first. Always. Brain cells are fragile. They can't survive more than a few minutes without oxygen. Less even. So blood flow to the brain is protected above almost everything else. Heart second. Because without the heart, nothing gets oxygen. So the heart feeds itself first. Its own blood vessels branch directly from the aorta. First access. Always. After that, kidneys, liver, other organs, then muscles, then skin. Extremities last. When oxygen runs low, blood vessels in the skin constrict. Less blood flows there. Your hands and feet get cold, pale. You don't decide this. It just happens. Quietly. Blood redirected inward, toward the core, toward what matters most. You might not notice, or you might just think you're cold, but it's not temperature. It's oxygen. Inside the cells that are still getting oxygen, things seem normal. Mostly. Mitochondria keep working. ATP keeps being made. But efficiency drops. Slightly. Because even when oxygen is present, if it's less than usual, if the concentration is lower, the mitochondria have to work harder to extract it. Enzymes function less efficiently. Electron transport slows. Not enough to stop, just enough to reduce output. And the cells that aren't getting enough oxygen, muscle cells in your legs maybe, or cells in your gut lining, they switch modes. They start making energy without oxygen. Anaerobic metabolism. It works. For a while. Glucose breaks down into lactate. A little ATP is made. Enough to keep the cell alive. But lactate builds up. It acidifies the cell, makes things harder. Lactate leaves the cell, enters the blood. The blood carries it to the liver. The liver converts it back to glucose, sends the glucose back out. A cycle. But it takes energy to run this cycle, more energy than it produces. So the body is losing ground. Slowly. Energy output decreasing. Waste accumulating. Systems compensating. But compensation isn't free. You feel tired. Maybe. Or maybe you just feel off. Hard to focus. Hard to move quickly. Muscles feel heavy. These aren't oxygen levels dropping to dangerous lows. Not hypoxia that would make you gasp. Just a slight reduction. Sustained. Persistent. Enough that cells notice. Enough that they adjust. There are sensors in your arteries. Chemoreceptors. They measure oxygen constantly. When it drops, they signal the brainstem. The brainstem increases your breathing rate. Deeper breaths. More frequent. Trying to pull in more oxygen. But if the problem isn't how much you breathe, if it's how much oxygen the blood can carry, or how well the blood reaches the tissues, or how efficiently the cells extract it, then breathing harder doesn't solve it. It just uses more energy. The body keeps trying anyway. Heart rate increases. Cardiac output rises. Blood pressure climbs slightly, all in an effort to deliver more oxygen, to push it through, to make up the difference. And for a while, it works. Enough. Enough to keep everything functioning. Enough to avoid collapse. But it's a higher baseline. A higher cost. More energy spent just maintaining normal function. Over time, this wears. The heart working harder. The lungs working harder. Cells operating with less margin. Less reserve. Less capacity to respond to additional stress. And if something else happens, an infection maybe, or physical exertion, or cold exposure, something that demands more oxygen, the body might not have it, might not be able to deliver it. That's when things become visible, when the shortage becomes obvious, when tissues start failing, when lactate builds too high, when the brain can't get enough, when the heart struggles. But before that, before the crisis, there's this quiet space, where oxygen is just slightly less, where cells are just slightly compromised, where the body is compensating, silently, constantly. You breathe. Air comes in. Oxygen crosses into blood, travels to cells, gets used. And you never think about it. Never notice the counting happening. But the cells notice. They always notice. And when oxygen drops even slightly, they begin deciding what to preserve, what to slow, what to sacrifice. Without telling you. Without asking. Because you don't feel oxygen running out. Not until it's almost gone. Not until the decisions have already been made. And by then, the body is already different. Still breathing. Still alive. But changed. Quietly. Invisibly. Irreversibly. Hunger begins in the stomach. A hollow sensation. A tightness. The stomach contracts, sending signals upward. You recognize it immediately. The need to eat. But that's not the hunger that matters. Not really. That's just the alarm, the first request. Your stomach can be full and your cells still starving. Your stomach can be empty and your cells still satisfied. The real hunger happens deeper, in places you can't feel, in tissues that have no voice, in cells that simply slow down when fuel doesn't arrive, and keep slowing until something breaks. Your stomach empties within hours of eating. 4, maybe 5 hours. The food moves into the intestines, gets absorbed gradually. Glucose enters the blood. Fat becomes droplets wrapped in protein. Amino acids scatter through circulation. For the next several hours, your cells feed on this. They pull what they need from the blood. Glucose for immediate energy. Fatty acids for sustained burning. Amino acids for repair and growth. Everything available. Everything accessible. But then the blood levels drop. Glucose falls first. The liver releases stored glycogen to compensate, keeps blood sugar stable. Your cells don't notice the transition. They just keep pulling fuel. This can last for hours. Half a day maybe, depending on how much you ate, how much you stored. But eventually, the liver's reserves thin. Glycogen depletes, and the body shifts strategy. It starts mobilizing fat. Adipose tissue receives signals. Hormones that say release, that say breakdown, that say, we need what you're holding. The fat cells comply. Triglycerides split into glycerol and fatty acids. They enter the bloodstream. They travel. This feels like nothing. You don't sense fat being released. Don't feel it traveling. Your body is feeding itself from internal reserves and you remain unaware. You might feel hungry in your stomach, but your cells are still fed. Days can pass like this. Your stomach growling. Your mind thinking about food, but your cells managing. Running on fat. Running on ketones. Running on what was stored for exactly this situation. But there's a threshold. A point where fat alone isn't enough. Where certain cells need glucose specifically. Red blood cells that can't use anything else. Parts of the brain that can't fully adapt to ketones. Cells in the retina. In the kidney. The body tries to make glucose from other sources. From glycerol released by fat. From lactate recycled by muscles. From amino acids. But there's only so much. Only so many molecules that can be converted. And when those aren't enough, protein becomes fuel. Not because the body wants to, but because glucose must be maintained, must be provided, at any cost. Muscle tissue begins to break down. Slowly at first. A few grams per day. Amino acids cleaved from structural proteins. Transported to the liver. Converted. Released as glucose. This is the hunger that isn't about the stomach. This is cellular hunger. Invisible hunger. The kind that consumes the body from within. The kind that takes strength before you notice strength is gone. You don't feel muscle being broken down. Not directly. You might feel weaker. Might notice you tire faster. That lifting something feels harder. That standing takes more effort. But you don't feel the catabolism. The body chooses which muscles to take from. It starts with skeletal muscle. The muscles you use to move, to walk, to lift. These are expendable. They're large. They hold protein. And movement can be reduced. The heart is protected. The diaphragm. The muscles essential for breathing. These are touched last, only when almost nothing else remains. Because without them, survival is impossible. But even protection has limits. Even priority systems fail. When protein depletion becomes severe, when muscle mass has dropped significantly, the body loses its capacity to protect anything. Everything becomes negotiable. Everything becomes fuel. Your immune system weakens. White blood cells slow their production. Antibodies decrease. The proteins that fight infection are broken down for glucose, because glucose is immediate survival, and infection is future risk. And the body always chooses now over later. Wounds heal slower. Collagen synthesis drops. The proteins needed to close a cut, to rebuild tissue, they're not being made as quickly, because making them requires amino acids, and amino acids are being used for fuel, for keeping blood sugar stable. The gut lining thins. Cells that line the intestines, they turn over rapidly under normal conditions, replacing themselves every few days. But when protein is scarce, replacement slows. The lining becomes fragile. Absorption decreases. Which means even if food arrives, the body can't use it as well, can't extract nutrients efficiently. The very system meant to end the hunger is compromised by the hunger itself. A cycle, a trap. The longer it lasts, the harder recovery becomes. And through all of this, your stomach might still feel empty, might still contract, might still send signals asking for food. But that emptiness is not the problem. That sensation is not the danger. The danger is deeper, silent. It's the cells losing function, the tissues losing mass, the organs losing capacity. It's the slow erosion of reserves, the quiet consumption of the body by itself, not as a choice, but as necessity. You can drink water and feel the stomach settle. You can fill it with volume. But volume isn't fuel. Volume isn't glucose or amino acids or fatty acids. Volume doesn't reach the cells, doesn't power mitochondria, doesn't build proteins. The real hunger doesn't have a location. It doesn't have a sensation you can point to. It's distributed, everywhere at once. Every cell sensing the deficit, every tissue adjusting, every system slowing. And the body tries to tell you, not through the stomach, but through fatigue, through weakness, through cold hands and slow thoughts, through wounds that don't close, through infections that linger. These are the symptoms of cellular hunger, the signs that fuel has been absent too long, that reserves are depleted, that the body is consuming itself. And still, you might not connect them, might not realize, might think you're just tired. But your cells know. They've been counting. They've been rationing. They've been prioritizing. And they're running out of options. Running out of things to break down. Running out of ways to keep going. The stomach can be silent. Full of water, full of air, full of nothing. And the cells can still be starving. Still breaking down. Still trying to survive. One molecule at a time. One protein at a time. That's the hunger that matters. The one you don't feel. The one that happens in darkness. In silence. in the space between what you notice and what is real. And it doesn't ask permission. It just takes. Until there's nothing left to take. And the body, finally, stops. Your body is always repairing something. Right now. A scratch on your arm from yesterday. The lining of your stomach, replaced every few days. Bone cells renewing themselves. DNA fixing mutations that occurred during the last cell division. Repair happens constantly because damage happens constantly. Cells wear out. Proteins unfold. Membranes tear. DNA accumulates errors. Most of this gets fixed before you ever notice it was broken, before it becomes a problem. But repair requires resources. ATP to power the enzymes, amino acids to build new proteins, nucleotides to patch DNA, lipids to rebuild membranes. All of this must be available. All of this must be delivered. When fuel is abundant, repair happens on schedule. Cuts close within days. Bruises fade. Sore muscles rebuild stronger. Broken bones knit. The body maintains itself, restores itself. But when fuel runs low, repair becomes expensive. Too expensive. The body begins prioritizing. Essential functions first. Heartbeat, breathing, brain activity. These cannot be delayed. Repair can. So it does. Slowly at first. Healing slows by hours, then days. A cut that would have closed in 3 days takes 5. A bruise lingers. Muscle soreness persists. The body is still repairing, just slower. You might not notice this shift. Might not connect the delayed healing to anything specific. Might think you're just getting older. Or that the injury was worse than you thought. But inside, the decision has been made. Repair has been deprioritized. Rationed. The cells responsible for healing are called fibroblasts. They migrate to wounds. They produce collagen. They build the scaffolding that holds new tissue together. But fibroblasts need energy to divide, to move, to synthesize proteins. When energy is limited, fibroblasts divide less frequently. They produce less collagen. They move slower. The wound remains open longer. The edges don't pull together as tightly. The scar that forms is weaker, more fragile. Bone repair works similarly. Osteoblasts build bone. Osteoclasts break down old bone. The balance between them determines bone density. When energy drops, osteoblasts slow. They produce less bone matrix. Less mineralization occurs. Osteoclasts continue working. They don't require as much energy. So bone breakdown continues while bone building slows. The balance shifts. Bone density decreases. Slowly. Imperceptibly. Until a fall that wouldn't have caused a fracture does. The gut lining repairs itself constantly. Epithelial cells divide every few days. They migrate up from the crypts. They reach the surface. They shed into the intestinal space. They're replaced immediately. This turnover requires massive energy. The gut uses nearly 20% of the body's total energy at rest. Much of that goes to cell division, to maintaining the barrier, to preventing bacteria from crossing into the bloodstream. When energy drops, turnover slows. Cells linger longer before being replaced. Older cells are less effective. Their tight junctions loosen. Small gaps form. Molecules that should stay in the gut leak through. Bacteria cross. The immune system responds. Inflammation increases. But the immune response itself requires energy. White blood cells must be produced. Antibodies must be synthesized. Inflammatory signals must be released. All of this costs ATP. All of this competes with other processes. And when fuel is scarce, even inflammation is rationed. Infections last longer. Viruses replicate more freely. Bacteria establish themselves more easily. Not because the immune system has stopped working, but because it's working slower, with fewer resources, with less capacity. DNA repair happens in every cell, constantly, thousands of times per day. Mutations occur naturally. Radiation causes breaks. Metabolic byproducts damage bases. Repair enzymes fix most of this. But repair enzymes need ATP. They need nucleotides to replace damaged sections. They need cofactors, small molecules that help them function. When resources are limited, repair slows. Some damage goes unfixed. It accumulates. Mutations persist. Most mutations are harmless. They occur in non-coding regions, or they're corrected during the next cell division. But some affect important genes. Genes that control cell division. Genes that suppress tumors. And when those mutations aren't repaired, risk increases. The brain repairs itself differently. Neurons don't divide. Once formed, they persist. But their connections change. Synapses strengthen and weaken. Neurotransmitters are recycled. Proteins are replaced. All of this requires energy. The brain uses about 20% of total glucose. Much of that goes to maintaining synapses, to synthesizing neurotransmitters, to powering ion pumps. When glucose drops, synaptic maintenance slows. Connections weaken. Memory formation becomes harder. Not impossible, just harder. It takes more repetition, more focus. And even then, the memories are less stable, more likely to fade. Learning slows. The brain still functions, still processes information. But building new pathways, strengthening new connections, that's expensive. That's deprioritized. When fuel is scarce. Sleep normally includes repair. Growth hormone is released. Cellular cleanup accelerates. Damaged proteins are recycled. Metabolic waste is cleared. But when energy is low, even sleep becomes less restorative. The body conserves. Repair during sleep is reduced. You wake feeling unrefreshed. Still tired. Still worn. Because the repair that was supposed to happen didn't happen completely. Was postponed. Was rationed. Over days, this accumulates. Small damages that didn't get fixed. Proteins that didn't get replaced. Membranes that didn't get rebuilt. DNA that didn't get repaired. The body becomes less functional. Less resilient. Not broken. Not collapsed. Just degraded. Slightly. Persistently. And the longer fuel remains scarce, the more degradation accumulates. The harder recovery becomes. Because repair doesn't just fix damage. It builds reserve. It creates redundancy. Extra capacity for when stress arrives. When energy is abundant, the body overbuilds. Strengthens beyond what's needed. Creates margin. But when energy is scarce, margin disappears. The body maintains only what's essential. Only what's required for immediate survival. Redundancy is sacrificed. Reserve is depleted. And when additional stress arrives, there's nothing left to draw on. No buffer. No flexibility. A minor infection becomes major. A small injury becomes significant. A brief exertion becomes exhausting. Not because the body is weak, but because it's operating at the edge, with no margin for error, with no capacity to spare. Repair will resume when fuel returns. The body will rebuild, will restore. But some damage can't be fully reversed. Some scars remain. Some bone density is lost permanently. Some mutations persist. And each period of scarcity leaves the body slightly more vulnerable, slightly less resilient, slightly closer to the threshold where repair can no longer keep up with damage, where degradation outpaces restoration, where aging accelerates. Not as a single event, but as an accumulation of days when repair cost too much, when energy wasn't enough, when the body had to choose, and chose survival over maintenance, chose now over later, chose function over resilience, again and again, until later arrives, and the cost becomes visible, and repair, finally, can't keep up anymore. Inside every cell, there are thousands of different proteins, each one built from a chain of amino acids that must fold into a precise three-dimensional shape. And that shape is everything, because the shape determines function, determines what the protein can bind to, what reactions it can catalyze, what signals it can transmit. A protein is not just a sequence, it's a structure, and structure requires energy to maintain. When a protein is first made, it emerges from the ribosome as a linear chain, unfolded, vulnerable, and in that state it's useless, sometimes even harmful, because exposed regions that should be hidden can stick to other molecules, can aggregate, can form clumps that damage the cell. So the cell has helper proteins, chaperones. They bind to the new protein, shield it, guide it through the folding process, use ATP to push and pull the chain into the correct configuration. This costs energy. Every fold, every twist. Once folded, most proteins stay folded, held together by weak chemical bonds, hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions, subtle forces that collectively maintain the shape. But these bonds are fragile. They break and reform constantly, and the protein must remain in an environment that supports them. Temperature matters, pH matters, the presence of certain ions matters, and energy matters, because without ATP, the chaperones that refold damaged proteins can't function, and proteins that unfold stay unfolded. Enzymes are proteins that catalyze reactions, speed them up by factors of millions or billions, and they do this by lowering the energy required for a reaction to occur, by binding to the molecules involved and holding them in just the right position, just the right orientation, so that bonds can break and form more easily. The active site is the part of the enzyme where this happens. A pocket, a groove, a cleft, shaped perfectly to fit the substrate, the molecule being transformed. But that shape must be exact. If an enzyme misfolds even slightly, the active site distorts, the substrate no longer fits properly, the reaction slows or stops entirely, and the enzyme becomes a useless molecule, taking up space in the cell, consuming resources just to exist, but contributing nothing. The cell can't afford useless molecules, not when energy is scarce, so it tries to refold them or recycle them. But both options require ATP, and if ATP is limited, neither happens efficiently. Misfolded proteins accumulate. Some enzymes are involved in energy production itself, proteins embedded in the mitochondrial membrane that transfer electrons, that pump protons, that synthesize ATP from ADP and phosphate. And if these enzymes misfold, if their structure degrades, energy production drops, which means less ATP, which means fewer chaperones active, which means more proteins misfold. A feedback loop, a spiral, each step making the next step worse. Other enzymes break down nutrients. They cleave glucose into smaller fragments. They split fatty acids. They disassemble amino acids. And without these enzymes functioning properly, even if fuel arrives, the cell can't access it, can't extract energy from it, can't use it. The fuel just sits there, unavailable. Like having wood, but no axe to split it. The resource exists, but can't be utilized, and the cell remains starved. Surrounded by potential energy it cannot reach. Digestive enzymes in the gut work the same way. They must maintain their shape to break down food into absorbable molecules. And when energy is low and protein synthesis slows, these enzymes aren't replaced as quickly. Older enzymes remain in service longer, and older enzymes are more likely to be damaged, more likely to have misfolded slightly, more likely to work less efficiently. Food passes through. Less of it gets absorbed. Nutrients are lost, even though food was eaten, even though the gut is full. The body can't extract what it needs. Enzymes involved in detoxification also suffer. Proteins in the liver that break down toxins, metabolic waste, byproducts of normal cellular function. And when these enzymes misfold or aren't replaced, waste accumulates, toxins linger, and the cell must divert energy to dealing with this burden, energy that could have been used elsewhere. The cell becomes less efficient, not because it's damaged, but because its tools don't work. Because the proteins that should be solving problems have become problems themselves. There are enzymes that repair DNA, that scan the genome constantly looking for errors, and when they find a mismatch or a break, they bind to it, cut out the damaged section, fill in the correct sequence, seal it back together. But these repair enzymes are complex, multi-subunit machines. If any subunit misfolds, the entire complex stops working. DNA damage goes unrepaired. Mutations accumulate. Slowly at first, then faster. The cell has systems to detect misfolded proteins, quality control mechanisms that tag them for destruction, that send them to the proteasome, a protein complex that chews them up, breaks them back down into amino acids that can be reused. But the proteasome itself is a protein complex. It requires ATP, and it requires correct folding to function. When energy is low, the proteasome slows. Misfolded proteins aren't cleared as quickly. They build up. Some misfolded proteins aggregate. They clump together because their exposed hydrophobic regions stick to each other. And these aggregates are toxic. They interfere with cellular processes. They clog up the cell's interior. They can even trigger cell death. The cell tries to sequester them, isolate them, pack them into compartments where they can do less harm. But this is a temporary solution, not a fix. The aggregates remain. In neurons, protein aggregates are especially dangerous because neurons don't divide. They can't dilute the aggregates by splitting into two cells. They must manage them for decades. And when aggregates accumulate faster than they can be cleared, neuronal function declines. Signals travel slower. Synapses fail. Memories become harder to form. Thoughts become harder to hold. Not because the neuron is dying, but because its proteins are failing. When energy drops, the cell faces an impossible choice. It can use its limited ATP to fold new proteins correctly, or it can use it to refold old proteins that have lost their shape, or it can use it to destroy misfolded proteins and recycle them. But it can't do all three adequately. So it prioritizes. New proteins get some attention. Critical enzymes get refolded if possible. Everything else accumulates, piles up, becomes a burden. The burden grows quietly. No alarm sounds, no pain signals fire. The cell just becomes progressively less capable. Reactions that should happen in milliseconds take seconds. Pathways that should be active are sluggish. And the cell compensates by working harder, by trying to make more of the functional proteins it still has. But making more proteins requires ATP, which is already scarce, so the cell falls further behind. Efficiency drops, output decreases, and the deficit widens. This happens across tissues, in muscle cells where enzymes that contract fibers misfold and strength declines, in liver cells where detoxification enzymes fail and waste accumulates, in kidney cells where transport proteins lose their shape and filtration becomes less effective. Each cell struggling, each cell compensating, each cell slowly failing. Not dramatically, not visibly, just functionally. You don't feel enzymes misfolding. You don't sense protein aggregates accumulating, but you might feel the consequences, the fatigue that doesn't resolve, the weakness that persists, the cognitive fog that lingers, the infections that take longer to clear, the digestion that becomes less predictable. These are symptoms, downstream effects, the visible signs of invisible failures, of proteins that forgot how to work. And when fuel returns, when energy becomes available again, the cell can begin addressing the backlog. It can refold some proteins, destroy others, synthesize replacements, restore function gradually. But the process is slow. It takes time. And some damage may be permanent. Some aggregates may be impossible to clear. Some enzymes may never regain their original efficiency. The cell recovers, but not completely, not back to baseline, just closer, functional enough, for now, until the next shortage, the next period of scarcity, when proteins misfold again, when enzymes fail again, when the cell struggles again, and each cycle leaves it slightly weaker, slightly less capable, slightly more burdened. Because proteins must fold correctly to work, and folding requires energy, and energy requires proteins that work. And when one fails, the other follows. And the system that seemed so robust, so resilient, reveals itself to be fragile. Built on balances, on margins, on the assumption that fuel will arrive, that ATP will be available, that help will come. And when it doesn't, the proteins forget. Not consciously, but structurally. They lose their shape, their function, their purpose. And the cell forgets too. How to work, how to repair, how to survive. One misfolded protein at a time. ATP is small. Smaller than you could imagine. 3 phosphate groups attached to a sugar, attached to a base. That's all. But everything depends on it. The name is adenosine triphosphate. Tri meaning 3. 3 phosphates bound together. The bonds between them hold energy. When one breaks, energy releases. the ATP becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. That energy does work. Powers a muscle contraction, transports a molecule across a membrane, adds a phosphate to a protein to change its shape, drives a chemical reaction forward. Whatever the cell needs, ATP provides. Then the ADP gets recycled. A phosphate is added back. ATP reforms, gets used again, over and over. The same molecules cycling, made, broken, remade. Your body holds about 250 grams of ATP at any moment. Not much, less than the weight of an apple. But that ATP turns over rapidly. In a single day, your body synthesizes and breaks down about 50 kilograms of it. 50 kilograms. From 250 grams. Recycled hundreds of times. This happens in the mitochondria mostly, in the inner membrane. Electrons flow through protein complexes. Protons pump across. The protons flow back through ATP synthase, and the flow drives synthesis. ATP synthase spins. Literally. It's a molecular turbine. Protons push through it like water through a wheel. And as it spins, it binds ADP and phosphate together, builds ATP, releases it. This happens constantly, in every mitochondrion, in every cell. 100 trillion cells, billions of mitochondria per cell, all of them synthesizing ATP, all of them feeding the body's needs. But synthesis requires substrate. ADP must be present. Phosphate must be available. Electrons must flow. Oxygen must arrive. Fuel must be broken down. Everything must align. When fuel drops, electron flow slows. Fewer electrons enter the chain. Fewer protons get pumped. The gradient weakens. ATP synthesis decreases. Not to zero, just less. The cell notices immediately. Not consciously, but molecularly. There are sensors that detect ATP levels, enzymes that change activity based on the ratio of ATP to ADP. When ATP drops, they respond. They signal. Some processes shut down. Non-essential reactions pause. Protein synthesis slows. Cell division delays. Growth halts. The cell conserves, prioritizes. But some processes can't stop. The sodium-potassium pump. It runs constantly, pumping sodium out, potassium in, maintaining the electrical gradient. This gradient is essential for nerve signals, for muscle contractions. The pump consumes about 30% of all ATP a cell makes, just to maintain ion balance. When ATP thins, the pump slows. Sodium leaks in. Potassium drifts out. The gradient weakens. Cells depolarize slightly. Neurons become less excitable. Muscles respond less readily. The heart's rhythm can shift. Not dramatically, just subtly. Enough to feel different. Enough to matter. In muscles, ATP serves another purpose. It detaches myosin from actin. These are the proteins that slide past each other during contraction. When a muscle contracts, myosin grabs actin. ATP is needed to release it, to reset, to prepare for the next contraction. Without enough ATP, myosin stays attached. The muscle stiffens. Rigor. This is what happens after death. Rigor mortis, when ATP production stops entirely. But it can happen partially, when ATP runs thin. Muscles feel tight, hard to relax. Movements feel stiff. Cramping becomes more likely. Because relaxation requires ATP as much as contraction does. The brain uses ATP differently, not for movement, for signaling, for maintaining the ion gradients that allow neurons to fire, for packaging neurotransmitters into vesicles, for recycling those neurotransmitters after release. Every thought costs ATP. When ATP drops, neurotransmitter release becomes less reliable. Synapses function less efficiently. Signals weaken. Thoughts take longer to form. Focus drifts. Memory encoding slows. Not because neurons are damaged, but because they lack fuel. The liver uses ATP to detoxify, to convert ammonia to urea, to process medications, to package fats for transport. When ATP thins, detoxification slows. Waste accumulates. Toxins linger. The kidneys use ATP to filter blood, to reabsorb useful molecules, to concentrate urine. When ATP drops, filtration becomes less selective. Useful molecules are lost. Waste is retained. Balance shifts. Every active process requires ATP. Every pump, every transporter, every synthesis reaction, every signal amplification. And when ATP runs thin, all of them slow together. Slightly. Synchronously. The cell tries to compensate. It activates backup pathways. Fermentation. Glycolysis without oxygen. This makes ATP, but not much. 2 molecules per glucose versus 30 or more with oxygen. It's inefficient, but it's something. And when the main pathway falters, inefficiency is acceptable. Survival requires any source, any amount. But fermentation produces lactate. Lactate acidifies the cell, changes the pH. Enzymes function less efficiently in acid, so even the backup pathway creates problems. Solves one issue, creates another. The cell also breaks down stored ATP reserves. Creatine phosphate. It's a small reserve, enough for seconds. Maybe 10 seconds of intense activity. Then it's gone. And there's nothing else. At that point, the cell must reduce demand, must lower its activity, must slow everything, or risk complete failure, risk losing ion balance entirely, risk depolarizing, risk dying. Some cells can tolerate low ATP for minutes, maybe longer. Fat cells, skin cells, they're metabolically quiet. They don't need much. But neurons can't tolerate it. Cardiac muscle can't. Brain cells start dying within minutes. Heart cells follow soon after. These tissues have no reserve, no backup, no time. So the body protects them, prioritizes blood flow to them, redirects glucose to them, ensures they get oxygen first, at the expense of everything else. But even protection has limits. Even priority fails. If ATP drops far enough. Right now, your ATP levels are stable, cycling normally, made and broken thousands of times per second, supporting every process, every function, every moment of life. But the system is tight. There's no large reserve, no warehouse of extra ATP, just the constant cycle. Synthesis matching demand. Balance maintained. Barely. And if demand exceeds synthesis, if fuel drops, if oxygen falters, If mitochondria fail, the cycle slows, ATP thins, and everything depending on it slows too. Struggles, fails, one molecule at a time, one reaction at a time, until the body can't keep up anymore. And the molecule you've never seen, the one that powered every moment, every breath, every thought, runs out, and everything stops. The brain is expensive, metabolically speaking, weighing only about 2% of your body, but consuming roughly 20% of all the glucose you take in. And this cost is non-negotiable, because thinking requires energy, maintaining consciousness requires energy, keeping billions of neurons ready to fire requires enormous amounts of ATP. But not all brain functions cost the same. Some are essential, some are optional, and when fuel runs low, the brain begins sorting them. Imagine a city during a power shortage, where electricity must be rationed, and officials decide which neighborhoods get power at which times. Hospitals and water treatment plants stay lit because lives depend on them. Residential areas dim during certain hours. Entertainment districts go dark entirely. No one decided these priorities arbitrarily. They were decided by survival. The brain is this city, and energy shortage forces the same triage. Essential functions remain powered. Everything else dims. The brainstem gets priority, the oldest part of your brain evolutionarily, the part that controls breathing and heart rate and basic reflexes. These functions existed before complex thought, before memory, before anything resembling consciousness. And they're protected because without them, you die within minutes. They're non-negotiable, always powered, always protected, even when everything else is failing. The hypothalamus maintains blood pressure, regulates body temperature, controls hunger and thirst, manages circadian rhythms, and these too are preserved because they govern homeostasis, the delicate balance that keeps internal conditions stable. When fuel drops, the hypothalamus adjusts its signals. It lowers your baseline temperature slightly, reduces your appetite for a while, alters your sleep-wake cycle, all to conserve energy, all to make the available fuel last longer. But the cortex, the folded outer layer where complex thinking happens, where decisions are made and language is processed and sensory information becomes perception, this part is more flexible, more dispensable in the immediate sense. You can survive with reduced cortical function. You can exist in a diminished cognitive state for hours or days while your brainstem keeps you breathing. So when glucose drops, cortical activity is the first to be rationed. Not shut down, just reduced, dimmed, made less available. The prefrontal cortex suffers earliest, the region responsible for executive function, for planning and decision-making and impulse control, for holding multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously, for what we call working memory. And this region is metabolically hungry. Its neurons fire frequently. They maintain complex networks. They require constant ATP to sustain their activity. When ATP thins, working memory capacity shrinks. You can hold fewer things in mind. Multitasking becomes harder. Focus narrows. Not because you're distracted, but because your brain can't afford to keep multiple processes active. Decision-making becomes slower, more effortful. You might notice yourself taking longer to choose between options, feeling less certain about conclusions, reverting to simpler heuristics rather than complex analysis. And this isn't cognitive decline in the permanent sense, it's energy conservation. your brain temporarily limiting its most expensive operations. Impulsivity may increase, not because control is lost, but because maintaining control costs more energy than letting impulses through. The prefrontal cortex acts as a brake, and brakes require pressure, and pressure requires fuel. Memory formation is also expensive, extraordinarily so. When you experience something new, your neurons must strengthen connections, must synthesize new proteins, must build structural changes that allow the memory to persist. And this construction requires not just ATP, but also the raw materials, amino acids, lipids, nucleotides, all of which must be transported and assembled and integrated into existing networks. When resources are scarce, memory consolidation slows. New information still enters. You still perceive, but the transfer from short-term to long-term storage becomes less reliable. Some memories never solidify. They fade within hours, as if they never happened. Old memories remain accessible because they're already encoded. The structural changes have been made, the pathways are established. Retrieving them costs far less energy than forming new ones, so during fuel scarcity, your brain might favor reminiscence over new learning. You might find yourself thinking about the past more than usual, not out of nostalgia, but because accessing old memories is cheaper than processing new experiences fully. The brain conserves by leaning on what it already has, on what's already built, on patterns already formed. The past becomes easier than the present. Attention requires sustained neural activity. A network of regions must remain coordinated, must suppress irrelevant stimuli while amplifying relevant ones, and this coordination is energetically demanding. When glucose drops, attention becomes less selective. Distractions slip through more easily. The filter weakens. You notice things you'd normally ignore, but you also miss things you should notice. The system becomes noisier, less precise, more prone to error, not because neurons are damaged, but because they lack the energy to maintain tight control. Language processing also costs energy. Generating speech requires coordinating motor areas with linguistic areas, retrieving words from memory, assembling grammar, monitoring output for errors, and comprehension requires parsing incoming sounds or written symbols, mapping them to meanings, integrating them into context. When ATP is limited, both production and comprehension slow. You might notice yourself speaking more slowly, pausing to find words, using simpler sentence structures, or struggling to follow complex conversations. The machinery still works. It just runs slower, like a processor throttled to save power. Emotional regulation is expensive too. The circuitry that modulates your emotional responses, that prevents irritation from becoming anger or worry from becoming panic, requires prefrontal cortex activity, requires inhibitory neurons firing to dampen limbic system signals, and inhibition costs more energy than excitation. When fuel is scarce, emotional control weakens. Small frustrations feel larger. Anxiety intensifies. Not because the situation has changed, but because the brain can't afford to regulate as effectively. Sleep architecture changes under energy scarcity. The brain normally cycles through stages: deep, slow-wave sleep for physical restoration, REM sleep for memory consolidation and emotional processing, light sleep for transitions. But when resources are limited, the brain may shorten REM periods, may reduce the depth of slow-wave sleep, may fragment the cycles. You sleep, but the sleep is less restorative, less organized. The brain is trying to rest while still maintaining essential monitoring. It can't fully power down, can't fully restore. Even dreaming becomes simpler, less elaborate, because dreams are metabolically active states. The brain is firing patterns, testing connections, processing emotions, and all of this requires glucose. Under scarcity, dreams might become shorter, more fragmented, less vivid, the brain conserving even in sleep, even in the state meant for restoration. The metaphor dissolves here. The city never had dreams, but the brain does, and even dreams become rationed. The brain makes these adjustments automatically. You don't choose to forget more easily, to focus less effectively, to feel emotions more intensely. These changes happen at the cellular level, neurons responding to ATP availability, synapses weakening when they can't maintain their strength, networks reducing their activity to stay within energy budgets. No conscious decision, just molecular accounting, just survival mathematics. The brain calculating constantly what it can afford, what it must sacrifice. Some people's brains are more efficient than others. Genetic variations affect how neurons use glucose, how mitochondria produce ATP, how synapses maintain themselves. And these differences mean that two people with identical fuel shortages might experience different cognitive effects. One might lose memory formation first, another might lose emotional regulation. The sequence varies, but the principle remains. Energy scarcity forces choice, forces prioritization, forces loss. And the brain decides, based on what keeps you alive, not what keeps you yourself. When fuel returns, when glucose levels rise, when ATP production normalizes, many functions recover. Attention sharpens again. Memory formation improves. Emotional regulation strengthens. The brain can afford to power all its systems simultaneously again. But recovery isn't instantaneous. Some changes persist. Some memories were never formed. Some synapses weakened and didn't fully re-strengthen. Each period of scarcity leaves subtle traces, small gaps, tiny absences. And if scarcity becomes chronic, if the brain must ration energy repeatedly, the cumulative effect becomes visible. Memory problems persist, attention doesn't fully recover, emotional volatility becomes baseline. The brain adapts to scarcity by permanently lowering some functions, by accepting diminished capacity as the new normal. Not because it's damaged beyond repair, but because it's optimized for survival under constraint. And survival under constraint means sacrificing, complexity, richness, the very things that make consciousness feel expansive. Right now, your brain is running at full capacity, all regions powered, all networks active, memory forming, attention sustained, emotions regulated, language flowing, the city at full illumination. But the infrastructure is fragile. The power grid is tight. And if fuel drops, if glucose thins, decisions will be made. Lights will dim. And you won't decide which ones. The brain will, based on ancient priorities, on what kept ancestors alive, on what keeps you breathing, and what gets forgotten, what gets lost, is everything else. Muscle is protein. Thousands of filaments, bundled together, actin and myosin, sliding past each other when you move. But protein is also amino acids, 20 different kinds, linked in chains, and chains can be broken when the body needs them. Not all amino acids are the same. Some can become glucose. The body knows which ones, knows how to take them apart, knows how to reassemble them into sugar. This happens in the liver mostly. Amino acids arrive through the blood, carried from wherever they came from. The liver converts them, through many steps, through enzymes, into glucose. The process is called gluconeogenesis, making new glucose from things that aren't glucose, from pieces, from fragments, from the body itself. When fat runs low, when glycogen is gone, the body turns here, to muscle, because muscle holds protein, and protein holds nitrogen. and nitrogen can be removed. The nitrogen becomes ammonia. Toxic. The liver converts it to urea. Urea leaves through urine. Harmless now. Dissolved. Gone. What's left are carbon skeletons, the structure of amino acids without their nitrogen. These can be rearranged, turned into intermediates, fed into metabolic pathways, converted to glucose, eventually. The body prefers certain muscles, not the heart, not the diaphragm. Those are protected, essential, non-negotiable. Skeletal muscle, the kind you use to walk, to lift, to move deliberately. That's where it starts. Legs first. Arms. The large muscles. The ones with mass. The ones you built through use, through repetition. They're the warehouse, the reserve. When food doesn't arrive, you don't feel it breaking down. No pain, no signal, just slow loss, gradual thinning, strength fading. Maybe you notice lifting something feels harder, stairs feel steeper, standing takes more effort, but you don't think muscle loss. You think tired. Think weak. Think age. The body takes a little each day. 50 grams maybe. 60. Depends on how much glucose the brain needs. How much the red blood cells need. How much must be maintained. At any cost. 50 grams of muscle becomes about 25 grams of glucose. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to keep the brain functioning. Enough to keep blood sugar from crashing. Enough to survive another day. Another night. Over weeks this adds up. 1 kilogram. 2. Muscle mass dropping. Visible now. Arms thinner. Legs narrower. The body is efficient about it. Takes from where it can afford, leaves what's needed, tries to preserve function, but there's only so much to take, only so much protein available, before function suffers. Muscles aren't just for movement, they're metabolic organs. They store glucose as glycogen. They burn fat. They produce heat. They respond to insulin. They help regulate blood sugar. When muscle mass drops, these functions decline. Less glycogen storage, less fat burning capacity, less heat production. The body gets colder, more easily. Metabolism slows overall. Muscle is active tissue. It burns energy even at rest. Less muscle means lower baseline, lower energy expenditure. The body conserves. Further, this makes recovery harder. When food returns, less muscle means less capacity, less ability to process glucose, less metabolic flexibility. The body that lost muscle gains fat more easily, because fat cells remain. They shrink when empty, but they don't disappear, and they refill quickly. Muscle cells don't return as easily. Building muscle takes time, takes stimulus, takes resistance. Exercise, adequate protein, all the things that might be absent. During recovery, during scarcity, during struggle. So the body composition shifts. Less lean mass, more fat mass. Even at the same weight, the ratios change. The function changes. the capacity changes. And the next time fuel drops, there's less muscle to draw from, less reserve. The body must turn to other sources sooner, to organs maybe, to proteins that should never be touched, to structures that can't be spared. But that comes later. For now, muscle loss is manageable, survivable. The body is still functioning, still moving, just weaker, just diminished. The person looks thinner, gaunt sometimes. Clothes fit differently. Bones show more clearly, through skin, through the thinning layer of what used to be there. They might not eat even if food is available. Appetite fades. The body stops asking, stops signaling hunger, because asking costs energy too. And energy is everything. Everything left. So the dissolution continues. Quiet. Invisible from inside. Visible from outside. Muscle turning to sugar. Sugar feeding the brain keeping consciousness. For a while longer. For as long as it can. Until the muscle is too depleted. Until there's not enough left. To walk. To stand. To sit up. And the body, still trying, still converting, still sacrificing, turns to the proteins it said it would protect, because there's nothing else. And protection, finally, fails. Not because the body stopped trying, but because muscle, eventually, runs out. The heart is different from every other muscle in your body, not because it's stronger or more resilient, but because it cannot rest, cannot pause, cannot take a moment to recover between efforts the way your legs can or your arms can. It beats 70 times per minute, 100,000 times per day, 3 billion times in an average lifetime, and every single beat requires energy, requires ATP, requires fuel delivered constantly, without interruption, without compromise. From the very beginning, from the moment when fuel first began to thin and the body started making decisions about what to preserve and what to sacrifice, the heart was always protected, blood flow redirected toward it, glucose prioritized for it, oxygen delivered first to its cells. Not because the heart is more important than the brain, but because without the heart, the brain gets nothing. Without circulation, oxygen doesn't arrive, glucose doesn't reach tissues, waste doesn't leave. The heart is the distribution system, and the distribution system must keep running for anything else to matter. So as the weeks passed and muscle dissolved into glucose, as fat stores emptied, as repair slowed and proteins misfolded, and ATP production declined across tissues, the heart continued receiving what it needed. The body stripped itself of reserves to feed cardiac muscle, diverted amino acids from skeletal muscle to maintain the heart's protein structures, prioritized oxygen delivery even as peripheral tissues went without. The heart kept beating, kept contracting, kept pumping blood through vessels, kept maintaining circulation, kept doing its singular essential task, until it couldn't anymore, because even the heart has limits. Metabolic boundaries beyond which it cannot function. And those limits were approaching slowly, quietly, as the body exhausted every other option, as every other system began failing, as the fuel that had sustained everything finally ran too thin. Cardiac muscle is dense with mitochondria, more than almost any other tissue. 30% of each heart cell's volume is mitochondria, tiny powerhouses generating the ATP that drives every contraction, every relaxation, every electrical signal. But mitochondria need substrate. They need oxygen and glucose or fatty acids or ketones. They need something to break down, something to oxidize, something to transform into energy. And when those substrates finally became too scarce, when the blood delivering them no longer carried enough concentration, when the body had nothing left to send, the mitochondria in cardiac cells began producing less ATP, not because they were damaged, but because they had nothing left to work with. The heart kept contracting, but each contraction became weaker. The muscle fibers still slid past each other, actin and myosin still interacted, but with less force, less coordination, less efficiency. The heart began pumping less blood per beat. Stroke volume decreased. Cardiac output dropped. The body compensated at first by increasing heart rate, beating faster to move the same amount of blood, trying to maintain circulation even as each individual beat became weaker. And this worked for a time, for hours maybe. But increasing heart rate costs more energy, requires more ATP, demands more from cells that were already struggling. The compensation accelerated the depletion, made the problem worse, sped the approach toward the threshold. The heart was working harder and accomplishing less, a system running itself into failure. Blood pressure began falling, not dramatically at first, just a slow decline as the heart lost its ability to generate sufficient force. And falling blood pressure meant reduced perfusion to tissues, meant less oxygen and glucose reaching cells, even in the brain and kidneys, the few organs still receiving priority. The brain began experiencing oxygen deprivation. Consciousness wavered. Thoughts became fragmented, disconnected, brief flickers of awareness separated by expanding intervals of absence. The person was still alive, still breathing shallowly, but awareness was fading, dimming, pulling inward to some unreachable center. The kidneys, deprived of adequate blood flow, stopped filtering effectively. Waste accumulated in the blood, electrolyte balance shifted, and these chemical changes affected the heart's electrical system, the precisely timed signals that coordinate contraction across all four chambers. The rhythm became irregular, arrhythmia, beats occurring out of sequence, some chambers contracting while others relaxed, coordination breaking down, efficiency plummeting further. The heart was still trying, still firing signals, still contracting, but no longer as an organized pump. And then the ATP in cardiac cells dropped below the critical threshold, the level beneath which actin and myosin cannot detach after contraction, beneath which ion pumps cannot maintain the gradients necessary for electrical signals, beneath which cellular processes cannot continue. The heart muscle began to stiffen, partial rigor. Some fibers locked in contraction, others unable to contract at all. The coordinated wave of contraction that had moved blood for a lifetime fragmented into uncoordinated twitches, weak spasms, ineffective tremors. Fibrillation, the medical term for this state, where the heart quivers rather than beats, where electrical chaos replaces organized rhythm, where no effective pumping occurs even though the muscle is still active, still consuming the last traces of ATP, still trying to fulfill its function. But trying without fuel is not enough. Intention without resources accomplishes nothing. The heart, protected until the very end, fed until nothing remained to feed it, finally reached the point where protection was meaningless, where prioritization couldn't save it, where the body's desperate conservation had simply delayed the inevitable.
Blood stopped circulating. Oxygen stopped reaching tissues. Carbon dioxide accumulated. The brain, already barely conscious, lost the final trickle of fuel it needed to maintain even minimal awareness. Neurons fired erratically for a few seconds, brief electrical storms. Then silence. Complete. Permanent. The heart continued quivering for a short time after consciousness ceased, perhaps a minute, perhaps less, the muscle fibers contracting randomly, using the last ATP molecules in their cytoplasm, but with each useless contraction more ATP was consumed, and none was being made,
because the mitochondria had nothing left to work with. Eventually, even the quivering stopped. The muscle became still, silent. The electrical activity faded. The heart, which had beaten without pause for decades, which had continued functioning when every other system began failing, which had been protected and prioritized and fed until the very last moment, stopped. Not because it was weak, not because it gave up, not because it failed before other organs did, but because energy, the fundamental requirement for all biological processes, had been exhausted. The body had run out of ways to make it, run out of substrates to break down, run out of reserves to mobilize, run out of tissues to cannibalize. The question posed at the beginning, whether the body can run out of ways to make energy, had been answered. Not theoretically, but completely. This is what happens when fuel becomes silence, when membranes fail, when mitochondria reach their limit, when the body burns everything, when oxygen isn't enough, when hunger exhausts all reserves, when repair stops, when enzymes forget, when ATP runs thin, when the brain sacrifices complexity, when muscle dissolves, and finally, when the heart, the last protected system, the final priority, can no longer keep going. This is the end of energy, the completion of the hierarchy, the final choice, the one the body cannot survive. And somewhere in that stillness, in that absence of circulation and consciousness and contraction, the question lingers, not as something to be afraid of, but as something to understand, as knowledge of how deeply the body fights, how many systems it will sacrifice, how long it will struggle to preserve the center, to protect what matters, to keep life continuing for one more moment, one more beat, one more breath. The body does not surrender easily. It does not stop trying. It conserves, adapts, redistributes, prioritizes, sacrifices, and endures. Until it can't. Until the fuel, finally, runs out. Thank you for listening tonight, for staying through this exploration of what happens when energy becomes scarce, when the body must make impossible choices. If this video helped you rest, if it gave you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, consider leaving a like, subscribing to The Sleepy Biologist, or supporting the channel through super thanks or membership. Your support makes these quiet investigations possible. And if you'd like, leave a comment about what biological process you'd like to explore next. What question keeps you curious as the night deepens? Until then, rest well. Let your own energy reserves replenish. Let your mitochondria work undisturbed. Let your heart keep beating. Quietly. Steadily. For as long as it can. Which will be longer than you think. Good night.